Hi, everybody. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate.
These are not acts of peaceful protest. These are acts of domestic terror.
The U.S. president doubling down as nationwide protests and violence continue 1 week after the Minneapolis killing of yet another unarmed black man at the hands of police. We'll ask about Donald Trump's threat to send in the army and his singling out of radical left Antifa activists, branding them a domestic terror group. Does the violence serve Trump's purposes of energizing those frightened by scenes of chaos, or show up a head of state who so far seems uninterested in playing healer in chief? Would a long, hot summer reminiscent of the 1968 race riots in America offer him a ticket to re-election? More broadly, how do political violence and the spectacle of political violence play out for citizens around the world in 2020? Here in France, the longer the destruction went on during the Yellow Vests movement, the more sympathy eroded for them. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Donald Trump's threat to send in the army. And joining us, he is the head of the Criminology and Justice Department at the University of Maryland. Gary Lafree is with us from the Washington suburb of Silver Spring. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
We also want to welcome anti-fascist activist Lacey McCauley, who is in the U.S. Capitol. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
And from New York City, which had its first night of lockdown in 7 decades on Monday, Bernard Harcourt, professor of law at Columbia University. Your latest book, The Counter-Revolution: How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Francois.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, that question of peaceful versus violent protest coming up again. How much has the looting and the violence overshadowed the core message of those outraged by the killing of George Floyd? Alison Sargent has more.
No justice, no peace, no racist police.
Hundreds fill Times Square in Midtown Manhattan, calling for justice for George Floyd ahead of the city's first overnight curfew in over 70 years. New York is one of dozens of U.S. cities that have imposed curfews deemed necessary by authorities to curb looting. The violence has marred days of peaceful protests and frustrated demonstrators, even if they understand the anger.
I mean, unfortunately, there are people out here looting, but you can't tell angry people how they can be angry. You know, that's like telling the slaves not to burn down Master's house. Burn that shit down if it means you got to get away. Agreed.
By nightfall, groups of looters began smashing windows and raiding stores in Midtown Manhattan, exactly the scene authorities were hoping to avoid. According to a tally compiled by the Associated Press, police have made 5,600 arrests nationwide since protests began last week, a number that will need revising after further arrests Monday, like here in Philadelphia, where police used tear gas to break up crowds. In Washington, D.C., protesters gathered peacefully in front of the White House were dispersed with tear gas and rubber bullets so the president could leave the grounds.
Are you prepared to use the military against U.S. citizens?
He headed for a photo op in front of the so-called Church of the Presidents, damaged during protests over the weekend. Donald Trump has declared himself the president of law and order and is threatening to send the military to states unless protests are brought under control.
Gary Lafree, what was your reaction when you saw the U.S. president make that trip from the White House across the street to St. John's Church?
Well, I suspect it's more a political move than anything else. Like, for example, when the president declared the idea of making Antifa a terrorist organization, it's pretty much just politics, because the only authority in the United States that can do that is the State Department. And it only applies to foreign terrorist organizations. The United States does not have a domestic terrorism capacity in the same way that it treats foreign terrorist organizations. So I assume the president must know that. So it strikes me as mostly a political move.
Strikes you as mostly a political move. Bernard Harcourt, where you are in New York City, what's the mood like after, again, a first night of curfew?
Right. Well, we're just waking up to the night, to the curfew, to the fact of the curfew, which was pretty radical. I mean, all of a sudden, all of our phones lit up with those emergency beeping sounds that there was going to be a curfew. But going to this question of the kind of focus on the violent act, I mean, it's clearly a strategic approach to deal with a large social issue, right? An enormous problem in this country having to do with the way in which policing and the way in which race relations exist in this country. So, but focusing on the minor acts of violence on behalf of some of the protesters and infiltrated by agents provocateurs from the right. I mean, focusing on that has to be understood as a deliberate act to try and kind of win the hearts and minds of the average Americans.
But Bernard, it's not a detail, is it? When you see the blocks of destruction there were in Minneapolis, when you see the scenes of looting in certain cities, particularly in Southern California.
Right. It is not a detail. And and we have to understand looting and forms like that of violent protest as being fully political, right? These are fully political acts. Even looting is a fully political act, and we've known that over the centuries. I mean, in other words, the French Revolution was there were precursors to the French Revolution, which were all about looting, les émeutes, mass mobilization, and movements like that are political. So we've got a political situation. The question is how that gets interpreted, how it gets focused on, how it gets used, how the conversation gets turned away from the real topic, which is race in America and policing and militarized policing and what I call the counter-revolution that's taking place, versus all of these ancillary questions that are terribly useful for law and order types, whether it was Nixon or Trump, terribly useful in order to kind of turn the conversation, get us to talk about that instead of the social problems, and also to kind of turn middle America, the average American, against any kind of protest.
I want to get back to the issue of whether or not that will succeed. First, though, let's listen to the brother of George Floyd. He spoke on Monday in Minneapolis, and his remarks were not directed against the U.S. president, but against those inside of his own community.
If I'm not over here messing up my community, come on. Then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all.
All right, Lacey McCauley. Violence, looting, that's not going to bring my brother back. Your reaction to what you just heard?
Well, in my opinion, if people are kind of speaking about the violence of the so-called looting, I think that you have to remember, actually, that's frankly a little bit of a waste compared to the violence of the everyday experience of marginalized people and people of color. This is not that I'm frankly not that interested in talking about store windows or merchandise being taken off of store shelves as compared to the lives of people who are not only being killed by police, but also lives of people that are just squeezed by the everyday system. And the store windows, the merchandise from shelves can be replaced. A life can't be replaced. And I think that that's one thing that you will hear a lot from the young people who are protesting. It's not, this movement is being led by Black youth. This movement is not being led by Antifa. It's not actually being led by, it's not about Antifa. It's actually about oppressed people who are rising up. And that is one thing that's happening. A riot is the language of the oppressed, and things do change as a result of rioting.
Things do change. I want to ask you about that. But first, you say store merchandise can be replaced. We know there are neighborhoods in places like Detroit and Washington that took decades, if never, to recover after the riots of 1967 and 1968.
You know, in the vast majority of cities, actually, the windows that have been crushed, the merchandise that has been stolen has been from large corporations, has been from actually luxury stores. And I'm wondering why people aren't talking more about, everyone's talking about, maybe Black-owned businesses. I empathize with that, but why isn't anyone talking about one of the only people who's been killed in these protests is a man in Louisville, Kentucky, who was standing near his business, a barbecue business in Louisville, Kentucky. He used to serve free meals to the police, and he got shot while standing near his business by the police. I think that this is unfair to be focusing on the looting when actually what we should be focusing on is what caused these uprisings to begin with.
Gary Lafree, right now, 1 week on, how is the conversation being, how should I say, framed in the United States?
Well, I guess I would push back a little bit with what Lacey just said. I live the area I live in was very much affected by the riots in 1968. And I do think it took a huge amount of time to get the community back in shape. And I do think a lot of the local residents paid a price for that. I imagine, after you have a big event like this, getting anybody to invest in a community becomes much more difficult. And I think a problem you face in interpreting what's going on here is a problem I think both people on the left and the right face, which is on the right, people want to see that the problem here is, if you will, a kind of a tumor, right? That this protest movement, this violent protest needs to be, we need to get those violent people out of there. But in a way, what you have is much more of a social movement. I mean, you could say it's comparing a tumor to the flu, where you've got a complicated set of responses that range from people that are very concerned about where the country's going and concerned about justice and are out peacefully protesting and are out trying to change the system for the better and want their children to have a better life than they did. But ranging all the way from people who are kind of free riders, basically, who do not share all those sentiments, who are committing criminal acts. I mean, it's just the way it is, that you get the whole spectrum in a movement like this, from people who are extremely well-intentioned and motivated for all the best reasons, all the way to everyday criminals, basically. Unfortunately, that's the whole mix. So I think what ends up happening is the right wing emphasizes the criminals and the left wing the sort of good actors that are trying to make society a better place. But the package is just a complicated package.
And we heard the President of the United States, who on Monday said he might send in the army.
First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Quickly solve the problem for them. We heard at the outset Gary Lafree telling us, Bernard Harcourt, how it is oftentimes the state's remits, although there is the Insurrection Act of 1807 in the United States. The last time it was used was when there were the Rodney King riots in the early 1990s. There again, it was a white police officer who was acquitted for on videotape beating up a black man that sparked the outrage. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, Bernard, it talks about the right of the people peaceably to assemble. It doesn't say the right to assemble under any circumstances.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the language that Trump is using about dominating the battlefield, which is the metaphor that he's using, is, I mean, we really need to focus on that. We really need to understand that what he's doing is he's using a warfare paradigm of governing, which is, in a sense, kind of throwing fuel on the fire, because the reason that we are where we are today is precisely because we've domesticated in this country a warfare paradigm, the counterinsurgency warfare paradigm that we were using in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, we talked about this, Bernard, when you had the Ferguson riots. The U.S. became more aware of the fact that you had these police departments with these surplus ammo and this militarization. What's happened since, though?
Right. Well, what's happened? I think what's happened since is an internalization of the logics of counterinsurgency warfare, such that much of the police culture today has internalized a notion of us versus them, of an internal enemy, of an enemy that we need to quell and eliminate. And very much, I mean,
So you're saying that the counterinsurgency tactics that General Petraeus applied in 2006, 2007 in Iraq have been brought home by some of the vets?
Oh, it's more than just that. It's been internalized by not just the vets, but everyone who has lived through and been close to the kind of counterinsurgency warfare paradigms that we have been using over the past decade, over the past 2 decades. I mean, our military has changed in the way it conducts war. We don't conduct war on big, large battlefields anymore. Starting with the war in Iraq, we turned to completely different methods, which have been developed in the 1960s for the colonial wars. And Petraeus, of course, was the one who refined those with the manual that he published in 2006. But the point is that all of those methods have kind of come home to roost. And so what we're seeing with the paramilitarized policing, but also what we're seeing with, the mentality that we see on the screen today so much in terms of the police-civilian encounters, is that there is a concept of these protesters and of ordinary citizens as being kind of an internal enemy. And I think that Trump is consciously playing on that when he talks about dominating the battlefield. And what it is it's throwing fuel on the fire, because what got us here was this turn, and what's being used to address the issues today, again, is this kind of counterinsurgency, a warfare model and language and talk and militarized responses. A militarized response to protest, is that a militarized domestic response to the protests today? Is that really what we need in this country?
Lacey McCauley, of course, the modern way, if you will, of protesting, I don't know if there's what the exact term would be, it predates the 2006, 2007. The whole world was surprised when there was this G7 summit that took place in Seattle, Washington in 1999, just a few years after the internet really went global, where suddenly crowd control was overwhelmed by the protesters at the time. How do you explain there came this sort of turning point at that time?
I think that, we could talk about the turning point in militarism in terms of crushing protest, in terms of technology. Technology has gotten a lot more comprehensive, and also, the use of electronic means.
You agree that it works with both sides, right? It was the protesters using these sort of violent tactics at times as a tactic.
Yeah, I think the technology has gotten a little better. I definitely don't think protest is new, and I don't think rioting is new. I think that, the methods may change slightly with time, but I think that, rioting and protesting and oppressed people rising up against their oppressors, this is something that is as old as recorded history. And I mean, it has changed a little bit. Here in Washington, D.C., you know, the other guest pointed out the militarism overseas. Here in Washington, D.C., our police officers train with the Israeli Defense Forces, who have honed their skills oppressing Palestinians. So, of course, you know, this is kind of with increased globalization, with increased technology. Of course, you see police departments able to do different and more brutal things. But, you know, this political moment, once again, is oppressed people rising up to the conditions they're in. Not only do we have police violence that just will not stop, people of color unable to actually just do anything without the terrorizing thought that they could be killed at any moment by a police officer. We also have this economic downturn spurred by the pandemic that we're currently in. And, you know, when you see people taking food from like a Target store, for example, you have to think about, okay, well, we've had an economic downturn and unemployment has been very high in this country. We've seen soaring number of unemployment. And frankly, what do people think is going to happen? This is one of the most predictable things if you look at the historical record. When the situation gets bad for oppressed people, they will rise up and reclaim their power. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Gary Lafree, is there a 21st century way of protesting, or is there a pandemic specific way of protesting?
Well, I definitely do think technology has changed the playing field, both on the part of protesters and on the part of the police. And I wanted to just circle back a little bit to comments that Bernard was making about the militarization of the response. I think one really interesting way to indicate just how far we've come is to contrast the two major ways we've dealt with Al-Qaeda. You know, the precursors to Al-Qaeda that almost brought down the World Trade Centers in 1993, when you think back to that period. Our response to that was entirely a criminal justice response. They were taken to the courts. Most of them were eventually convicted. They spent time in prison. But there was no sense that, you know, this was a war on Islam, or it went through the regular criminal justice system. Whereas the way we responded to 9/11 was almost entirely right off at the get-go, a military response that involved, you know, a war on terrorism, essentially. And you look at the implications of those two, and they're quite profound, basically. And I agree with Bernard that some of that thinking and technology has found its way into police thinking as well. And there are a lot of, you know, there are situations where a country has no other choice but to bring in the military. But it has big consequences, basically, because, you know, you sort of throw out a lot of limits. You're not as worried about rights and free speech. You're interested in winning at any cost. And even just on a domestic level, it's, you know, if you're going to spend money on anything, it's going to be on war. It's not going to be part of a budget struggle between, say, police.
And with hindsight, Gary, did the U.S. have a choice when it did bring in the military in 1968, in 1992?
Well, I think the big difference so far, at least in those, and I can't think of any counter examples, is the local authorities were calling to bring in the police. This happened even during the Rodney King incident, whereas what President Trump was suggesting in the clip you played is him unilaterally sending in the police. And I think you'd have to go pretty far back in history to find an example of that.
All right, we mentioned how there is this dichotomy in the U.S. right now between a U.S. president and the protesters. And again, he has singled out Antifa activists. Brian Quinn has more.
American cities smoldering as protests over racism and police brutality spark some of the country's worst civil unrest in decades. For President Donald Trump, the culprits are clear.
The violence and vandalism is being led by Antifa and other radical left-wing groups who are terrorizing the innocent, destroying jobs, hurting businesses, and burning down buildings.
Trump has vowed to label Antifa a terrorist organization, a move he lacks the legal authority to carry out. But his plan faces yet another hurdle. Antifa, short for anti-fascist, is not an organization as such. Instead, it's a leaderless movement, autonomous cells of left-wing activists who share the belief that Nazis and white supremacists have no place in public life and that their ideology must be met by direct action, using aggressive tactics like vandalism and physical confrontation. The movement draws its name from socialist organizations in the 1930s dedicated to fighting the rise of fascist parties in both Germany and the UK.
I think many people would agree there came a time across Europe when standing up to fascists and Nazis violently was legitimate. But anti-fascists argue that the best way to stop that from being a necessity is to prevent them from organizing, prevent them from being able to express their message before it gets to the point where there's a civil war.
Since Trump's 2016 election, a resurgence of white nationalist groups has led to increased visibility for Antifa, including at a 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where a young counter-protester was killed by a white supremacist. U.S. law enforcement groups and federal officials say members of both far-right and far-left groups have contributed to violence and property destruction in recent days. Some observers on the left fear that Antifa is being cast as a scapegoat by a right-wing government to justify heightened police violence and a further crackdown on dissent.
So, Lacey McCauley, is Antifa, and you say, and we heard you loud and clear, they're not at all leading this movement, but they have been present. Are they serving the interests of Donald Trump here?
First of all, there are Black and brown Antifa. There are Black and brown anarchists. I think that, Donald Trump is kind of relying on a lot of racist tropes. And this is, really unfortunate how many people are believing yet another Trump lie. This is ridiculous that, frankly, to think that, first of all, that Antifa, so-called people who have been organizing under the banner of Antifa or anti-fascist, are behind all of this. If we could have actually gotten huge numbers of people in the streets like we've seen over the past few days, actually we would have done it years ago. Also, this is just one of those moments where we have to realize that the movement is being led by Black youth. And it's frankly interesting that I'm here on this show and not one of the people who actually has been providing the real charge for this movement. But, this is another Trump lie. And that's what I have to say about that.
Do you have the sense that the violence is serving Trump's interests?
I don't believe so. I think that the more that the news media focuses on the so-called violence of people in the streets rising up and looting and spinning it and propagandizing around how uncomfortable they feel seeing, a store window get smashed or something, I think the more that, the media serves that purpose, the more it may actually further demonize and vilify people who are rising up to reclaim their rights and their power. But I think that a lot of people out here in the United States are hurting, and they actually understand the points being made by protesters. We're in an economic downturn. We're in a pandemic. We are suffering from horrendous police violence that hasn't gone away, no matter how much peaceful protest people have done over the past decades, and they have been doing peaceful protests over the past decades. And so I think that everyday people are understanding the points being made by the young people in the streets. And, I wish that, frankly, the news media would focus a little more on that.
Yeah, whether or not to demonstrate peacefully is something that we talked about a lot here in France in 2018, 2019, when we had the Yellow Vests movement. And we saw it again last December. For instance, we had pension reform protests. Now, there was, for instance, those images of ballerinas outside of the Paris Opera House protesting. Perhaps they were striking images, but they were also there was also violence at times that was uncontrolled by those who were organizing the unions, the protests, the so-called black blocs, people dressed all in black, who scuffled with riot police at demonstrations. Bernard Harcourt, at the end of the day, the violence we saw with the yellow vests, with the pension reform protest, did it help or hurt Emmanuel Macron?
Okay, so I mean, I think that the way that we phrase these questions is really important. I mean, in other words, when you ask the question, does the violence serve the interests of Donald Trump, or does the violence help or hurt the process in France with Macron? I mean, you have to understand that this is all political. This is all political spin. The interpretations of this violence is all part of the political struggle. Okay, and of course, Trump is a master at spin, a master at social media, a master at reality TV. And of course, the effort right now is precisely to spin this, to focus our attention on the violence in order to distract us from the legitimate claims and the struggle that's taking place today over race relations in this country. Or in France, the effort was to spin the few acts of violence, the Fouquet's burning, for instance, to undermine the legitimacy and the credibility of a movement which was the Gilets jaunes.
But that cafe, the Fouquet's on the Champs-Élysées in Paris burning,
right?
Again,
right.
That helped Emmanuel Macron, did it not? He had a two-pronged approach, arguably. On the one hand, he did what was called a grand debate, lots of town hall-style meetings. On the other, he's been accused, and he's denied it, but he has been accused of letting the violence play a little.
Right. I mean, the reason is that is one of the best ways to kind of turn a population against the protesters. When you think about it, the yellow vest protests, there were, according to French numbers, there were 84,000 people in the streets across France. 84,000. Now, all that we see then is, of course, the burning of the Fouquets, or an incident involving a prize boxer who hits a police officer, right? Now, but that's the way to delegitimize those claims, right? I mean, we can't be blind to that. We can't ignore that. I mean, if you focus on something that people are going to be outraged about, they will then turn that against the entire movement, against the protest, against the issue that people are trying to bring forward. So we have to understand that all of this is political, and our interpretation of it is political, and we all feed into it as well. And so when the media, for instance, is highlighting the violence, that is going to play into particular interpretations that are going to deal.
But you can argue it the other way, Bernard. You can say that the violence did work at the beginning, at least, since almost immediately the government backed down on a gasoline tax here in France. And we had an African American in the show on Monday here saying civil disobedience is great, but if we don't make our voices heard very loudly, nothing is going to happen. So.
Right.
Does violence work?
But that's because there's a way in which we are like moths attracted to an electric bulb, and the bulb is scenes of violence, frankly, and so that's why those scenes are the ones that get clicked on social media. Those are the ones that stream on television, and those are the ones that we end up spending all our time talking about it, because because those get us going in some way. Trump understands this perfectly well. So did Macron, and so do most political leaders who realize now. But of course, so do protesters, right? And so, I mean, it's also understood among protesters that in order to draw attention, it's not necessarily going to work to have 10,000 people kneeling or 84,000 people walking the streets peacefully. So this plays slightly on both sides, but the question is, who has the kind of political savvy and strategies? And I would say these are tied to counterinsurgency strategies from the 1960s to turn this in their favor.
So Gary Lefree, I'm going to ask you the question that all my French friends ask me almost on a daily basis these days. Is this a ticket to Donald Trump's re-election?
Well, I just want to point out something that I don't think has come up in the conversation yet, but I think it's very important because we've been focusing, of course, on what's essentially a left-wing movement. If you look at the way Trump, for example, responded to the Charlottesville attack a couple of years ago, he sort of said, well, there's good people on both sides, basically, of this issue. We've actually, at our institute, though, been doing some work. We collect a database called the Global Terrorism Database, which has every terrorist attack in the world for about the past 50 years recorded. And we can look at violence by the left and the right. We also have a similar database just for the United States. And one of the striking things over the past half century is that political attacks by the right are way more violent than political attacks by the left, which I don't think has entered into our conversation yet. So when Trump is trying to sort of count those two groups as the equivalent, at least in terms of, certainly in terms of the United States. And
do voters know that?
I don't think it is well known. But I mean, you could start, compare, say, a Timothy McVeigh, basically, to ELF members or ALF members. ELF and ALF, as far as we know, have never killed anybody, protesting environmental degradation or the treatment of laboratory animals. Whereas a lot of right-wing groups are really going out for a body count. It's striking when you look at the data over a long period of time. So they are not equivalent in that sense, at least in terms of having an agenda that is trying to rack up a body count.
And again, the part of that issue is Donald Trump didn't mention the First Amendment in his speech on Monday, but he did mention the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. And when he said that, that raised a lot of alarm bells. Lacey McCauley, we're always amazed here in Europe when we read these kinds of numbers, but there's a private firm called Small Arms Analytics and Forecasting, which estimated that, I'm reading here, 1.7 million guns were sold in the month of May alone. This year, and that is an 80% jump over last year. Can you explain that to us?
Well, I think of it as pretty terrifying because I guess I have the perception that most of those guns are being bought by right-wingers, and I think that this kind of goes into something else that we haven't actually addressed yet either, which is all of this is happening in a larger context of a march toward fascism in our country. And the right wing being more emboldened, going out there with guns. They have been protesting with guns, going out there, as we saw in Philadelphia, with bats ready to kind of rough people up. This is occurring absolutely, and they are kind of the brown shirts, the militias of Donald Trump, and he knows this. Donald Trump knows this, and he will do things to play to that base. And all of this is happening in the context of our march toward fascism. The thought that Donald Trump wants to make anti-fascists or Antifa terrorists, this is all happening as part of a march toward what he would like to see as more of a fascist country. That Antifa terrorist designation will be used against any dissident. It does not matter if you've ever thought about being fascist or anti-fascist. That designation will be used against a lot of people. And, we're seeing, U.S. fascism. U.S. fascism is coming in, waving an American flag and a Bible, as it happens. And I guess, small arms being bought by everyone. They're waving flags, Bibles, and guns.
We're running short on time. Gary Lefree, do you agree that there's a potential march on fascism in the United States?
Well, I mean, it's worrying. I mean, the United States is unique among certainly democracies in terms of the number of weapons and the complete inability for, even though I think a pretty large majority of the country supports some sort of sensible policies on weapons, we just seem to be unable to do anything to slow that down. And you see it at every level. You see it with spree shooters. You see it even, we're doing a lot of work right now. Baltimore, for example, has this big homicide surge right now, and you look at the weapons on the street as well, and they're extremely deadly. It's almost like an arms race going on between people in the street and the police, and so yeah, I think it is very worrying.
Talks about the Second Amendment. What's that supposed to mean?
Well, I think we're, as a country, very polarized on that point, with two very different views of it.
Is he telling people to arm themselves?
I think that's kind of the message that certainly comes out, maybe not even so subliminally.
But it's a clear call out. It's clearly dog whistling. You couldn't get a more clear signal, and you have to listen to every word he says the first time, because he's going to walk it back. But you have to listen to what he says. We need to dominate the battlefield, and we need to protect. The only right he's talking about is the Second Amendment, right? In this speech. I mean, read that text. And he talks about the only right he comes up with of the Bill of Rights is the Second Amendment right to bear arms. What is he saying? He's communicating directly to not only the right, but I mean the extreme fringes of the right. I mean, he's communicating to those men who were walking fully armed into the assembly in Michigan, right? That's who he's talking to. He's talking to the militia. He's talking to the right militia. And you've got to just look at the words he's saying, right? I mean, it's incredible that a president of the United States will be talking about bringing in the military, and in the same discourse, talking about the only civil right being the right to bear arms. We know what he's saying.
Right. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we're short on time. But I want to thank you so much, Bernard Harcourt, for joining us from New York City. I want to thank Lacey McCauley in Washington, Gary Lafree in Silver Spring. I want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. There's much more on this topic on our website, france24.com. Bye for now.
As the worldwide health crisis continues, the American Constitution is being used as a strategic tool in how to respond to the decisions of scientists. In southern conservative states, the divide between Republicans and Democrats is widening.
President Donald Trump wants this nation opened again. He's been hijacked by doctors who do not have our nation's best interest in mind.
The president's supporters are relying on rights enshrined in the First and Second Amendments. Freedom of worship, the right to bear arms, protect themselves, travel, and challenge containment measures.
This is a virus. It's an excuse to keep people enchained and controlled.
The political battle has only just begun. Americans are writing a new page in their history. Don't miss Reporters on France 24 and France24.com. Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24. A different take on the news.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.